Hello and welcome to the 7th edition of Exploring Enterprise, the podcast series from the Enterprise Research Centre. I'm Stephen Roper, Director of the Enterprise Research Centre, and today I'm joined by two of my colleagues from the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise, or NICRE as we know it, Dr Barbara Tocco, who's Centre Manager and Senior Research Associate based at Newcastle University, the lead partner in NICRE, and Professor Tom MacMillan, Deputy Director at NICRE and based at the Royal Agricultural University in Gloucestershire. And I'm delighted that we're also joined by Chris Jewitt, founder and CEO of Food and Drink North East, a community interest company. And Chris is also an Innovation Associate of NICRE, or the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise. Today, we're going to be talking about the UK's changing food economy and some of the implications and opportunities that the changes in the food economy present for SMEs. So we'll do a couple of introductions first, I think. Chris, tell us a little bit more about Food and Drink North East and what you're actually doing. What's its mission?
Thanks, Stephen. Food and Drink North East, or FADNI, we're a grassroots trade organisation that was set up in February 20. And I suppose our main objectives were to support and promote and advocate on behalf of the food and drink network here in the North East, which is something that we haven't had for a very long time here. So we're now a network of over 900 stakeholders across supply chain here in the region. And fundamentally, our main driver and our main mission is to grow the sector's economic contribution to 10% GVA by 2025. It currently sits at around 2 to 3%.
We'll come back to the future prospects for the sector a little bit later in the podcast, Chris, and it'd be interesting to explore the perspective from the Northeast and also from Gloucestershire with Tom. Barbara, tell us a little bit more about NICRE. What's the organisation about? What's it trying to do?
Thanks, Steve. So NICRE, as we call it, is the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise, which we established in September 2020. So essentially, we are a research, innovation and knowledge exchange initiative. We're funded by Research England. And the rationale for its establishment was to really unlock the potential of rural economies across the country and foster the capacity, innovation and resilience of rural enterprises. And just to say that we focus on 3 priority areas. One is around research, so really strengthening the evidence base. So trying to fill gaps in existing knowledge. Then we have a series of pilot innovation projects around the 3 regions and across the country. So the idea is really to catalyze rural innovation. So working alongside rural businesses, rural communities, and funding is one of the key examples of successful projects that we are running in Northeast England. And trying to respond to societal challenges, trying to develop solutions that can be scaled up and replicated in other contexts or sectors. And lastly, we engage closely with policy and practice. So the idea is to improve the effectiveness and design of better policies, but also practices, essentially raising the profile of rural enterprise. So this is what we do in a nutshell.
So Barbara, thank you very much for that. That's a helpful overview of NICRE. Tom, you've been very involved in policy development recently as an expert advisor on the new UK National Food Strategy. Why does the UK need a food strategy, and tell us a little bit about the kind of key themes that are sort of driving that, would you?
Sure, and hello. So we've got, both in the UK but also around the world, this huge set of challenges that come together around food. So challenges that we face in all sorts of other areas of our lives. So climate change being the one that is probably looming largest, but also a kind of crash in biodiversity, so sort of decline in the nature that's out there. You've got then on the health side, problems around obesity and overweight and other diet-related diseases, which are a huge driver of not only premature death, but also people living with disabilities, one kind or another, for many years, which is both a tragedy in its own right, but also a huge public health cost. So you've got this set of things that come together around food, and they're not only warrant attention in and of themselves, but also food's going to be massively affected by them. What we eat is massively affected by them. We need to plan for that. But also we can only solve those problems if we deal with the food part. And by one way of thinking, you just sort of take each on its own. So you have a committee on climate change, like we do, that deals with the climate change bit. You have Department of Health dealing with the obesity and diet-related disease bit, and so on. But actually, that's how we've been doing things for years, and it hasn't really worked. It's not coming together around food, partly because the way we think about food, the way the food sector is structured, is complicated and not necessarily the same as, say, the energy sector or other sectors. So we need to understand those differences. But also there's tensions and synergies between these different issues, between climate change and health, and to do with how we change our diets and so on. So we need that sort of food system view to be able to develop a strategy that will actually work, that will pull the right levers kind of at the same time across these different areas, so that we end up with the right result on these different outcomes like climate change and health. So that's the logic for the food strategy. It came out of when Michael Gove was in DEFRA, was Secretary of State in DEFRA. He commissioned it, and he commissioned Henry Dimbleby to be the lead independent reviewer. Henry had worked previously doing a similar job on a school food review when Michael Gove was in education, and so I'm sure that kind of contributed to him being selected to lead this review. And it took place over a bit over 2 years, and we published the final report in July 2021, so last summer.
And the food strategy must be linked very strongly to the changes in the sort of agricultural support that are being put in place currently by the government as we move away from the Common Agricultural Policy. Was that a consideration in the development of food strategy, or was that just a kind of background factor?
Definitely a consideration in developing the food strategy and in Gove commissioning it, because a lot of the reforms we're currently seeing were initially shaped when he was Secretary of State in DEFRA, and that led to the agricultural white paper, agriculture bill, and Agriculture Act now, that's shaping the current changes that are coming in. And so yeah, it's very much part of the picture. I think there's a sort of scope question with something as potentially broad as the food strategy, but we ended up on agriculture policy getting into I guess what you call the sort of the big questions about the amount of money, of taxpayers' money, that should be or shouldn't be going into that sector, roughly what the priorities might be. So sort of a high level view on where things might be improved relative to how they're going at the moment, but not getting down in the detail of the very specifics of the policy design, which there's a huge amount of work already going on with.
Chris, I want to come to you in a second and just ask you about the experience of businesses over the last 2 years. But Tom, it must have been a very difficult period to begin to formulate a strategy in, when you've got the effects of the pandemic actually influencing almost everything in our lives. Has that changed or shaped the food strategy in any way? I mean, I don't know whether it's increased the priority, for example, around food security that there might have been as we've gone through the pandemic period.
The way we dealt with that in the food strategy was to put out a part 1 report, which came out the summer before, so in July 2020, which dealt really directly with the issues emerging straight out of the pandemic and the first lockdown, and dealt with them kind of urgently because they were urgent issues. One of the effects of the pandemic has been to expose things that have been there all along and to throw them into relief. And so in what we call the plan, or the sort of part 2 report, the main report that came out in July 2021, we focused on those bigger issues, that some of which have been accentuated by the pandemic. And you mentioned food security, but some of the health inequalities and so on around food have been accentuated by the pandemic. And so, we covered those, but we were very much focused on dealing with the underlying structural issues that have been there before the pandemic and are still there afterwards, and are getting bigger and bigger, and in some cases are as deep in their effects as the effect of the pandemic itself. And just briefly, in that part 1 report, some of the things that we found around food in the pandemic were really incredibly striking. So you had this roller coaster for the hospitality sector, even as food retail was growing. You saw 4/5 of hospitality businesses closed in the first lockdown, compared with about 1/5 of a quarter of manufacturing and retail businesses. You had this because food sector workers, hospitality sector workers had, and food sector workers had lower savings than on average than people in other sectors of the economy. You had, combined with high furlough rates, you had this high sort of economic exposure of people in that sector, which made them relatively vulnerable. And then you had all the sort of supply and demand stuff around, pressures from stockpiling. You can't stop your cow lactating the same way you might hold a production line for a bit or whatever. So you had, these sort of stories of farmers needing to throw milk down the drain and so on, where supply and demand went massively out of kilter at various points, if only for short periods. You had price rises, but mainly initially by stealth in a way, because of promotions disappearing off the shelves, even if prices on the face of it were staying relatively stable. And then the issue we've come back to again and again in the food strategy is all the diet-related diseases, both of the contributor to as a risk factor in the effects of COVID, but also the deep inequalities in around what people eat and the effects on their health. The huge rise in food bank use. And so those kind of issues massively affected the recommendations, both directly in part 1, but also in what we said in part 2 in last summer.
Thanks, Tom. I think it's really interesting to get your kind of top-down perspective, this whole sort of strategic perspective. And Chris, you're working kind of at the coalface, I suppose, in a little bit in a way directly with businesses. Do you recognise the picture that Tom's painted? Are those the kinds of pressures that your companies have faced over the last couple of years, or has it been a rather different picture in the Northeast, perhaps?
No, I think what Tom's just set out there correlates exactly what we've seen. I mean, we have the luxury, I suppose, as an organisation, the way we've built ourselves up. We're quite a broad church in that we work with David and Goliath, I suppose. So we work at both ends of the supply chain. And I think, we could go down many rabbit holes about how this has played out. But if you look certainly at the sort of grassroots food economy, so if you look at your smaller food entrepreneurs, you're talking kind of what I would call post-kitchen table businesses that are, there's particularly buoyant scene in the UK. They're heavily reliant upon B2C sales, so over-the-counter food markets, events, things that are determined by face-to-face footfall. And for many of them, that was switched off overnight. And because a lot of them weren't digitally enabled, they had no real solution to try and move their produce in any other way. So, the stories that Tom just pointed out there around dairies pouring milk down the drain, we heard all of that across meat, fish, dairy, and all of the other clusters in the sector. And then, building on top of that, we saw the food service sector, who are entrenched in local supply chain and procurement into local authorities, schools, hospitals, and particularly in hospitality. Well, that tap was almost turned off whilst we had that period of time when, I suppose, business was trying to innovate and pivot and work out what they were going to do next. So we saw a lot of businesses here, certainly, I'd say kind of between the 1 million to 5 million pound turnover bracket in terms of food service businesses. Some of them didn't exist, after 6 months. They folded because they really didn't have a solution to that problem. And obviously that has a seismic ripple effect right down the supply chain and back to agriculture. And picking up again on what Tom said about the sort of jobs and skills element. I mean, if COVID was the nail, then Brexit was the hammer to drive that nail in, because what we were seeing in the jobs and skills workforce was not only the sort of impact on seasonal workflow and not being able to actually make our supply chains run efficiently, but also when you look at the trends in hospitality, and this will have a long-term impact actually, and this is a very, very sort of subjective view on what happened in hospitality. But you're seeing, 10-20% of chefs leaving the industry to go and work for Uber because, it's an easy transition, that they make a living on their own terms, and it takes them out of what are particularly hard conditions to work in the first place. So these are really sort of far-reaching long-term impacts that you're going to see within the industry. And I think I touched upon this earlier. The sort of clusters within clusters where some of the challenges were very, very specific to that particular category. So if you look at breweries, for instance, you see the rising trend over the last 5 to 10 years has been to try and bolster and develop add-on and diversify sales within their business. Tap rooms were critically important, but when that comes to accessing hospitality and leisure grants, it was never very clear cut. So you'd get lots of breweries who didn't qualify and received no funding at all. And we've seen some of the most buoyant and biggest breweries here in the region fold, or at least in the very, very sort of best case scenario, keep themselves just hanging on by a thread. And then finally, I think what I'd say, and it's I think the B word was going to have to crop up. It's the impact on exports that we saw. So when you saw, I was very much entrenched at that at the time because I was working for the Department of Trade, and we were looking at companies who were battling with the impacts of COVID at the same time as trying to work out how to look at groupage to get produce into Ireland, or how to interpret certificates of origin, and they just didn't have the bandwidth. And even those that were prepared were still ill prepared for what came at them very, very quickly.
Thanks, Chris. And I suppose we've heard lots of stories over the last sort of year or 18 months about particular sectors being hit, very hard by the changes in regulation around Brexit. And I'm kind of very aware of things like the shellfish sector, for example, where much of their export market to Europe seems to have sort of disappeared in a wave of legislation and difficulty of exporting live mussels, for example, across to the continent. I guess the counterpart to that is we've seen some businesses thrive during the sort of pandemic period. And certainly in some work that NICRE did recently, many businesses, many rural businesses and many urban businesses, not necessarily in food, but across the economy, reported a bit of a mixed kind of impact of the pandemic. In many cases, reductions in turnover, but also creating the opportunity and the pressure to innovate and pivot. And I wonder whether you've seen examples of that among the food and drink companies in the Northeast.
Yeah, we have, and I think the challenge with all of this is that this very specific set of circumstances have been a very cruel acid test for, I suppose, long-term business resilience, whether we like that or not. And I think a lot of the businesses that didn't survive probably wouldn't have survived in the long term anyway. We did a lot of work, which I'll come on to with Food and Drink Northeast in terms of business support. And you could identify those ones that were willing and able to innovate to the ones that were a little bit more cumbersome, because it just wasn't in their business culture. And if you have not got that in your business culture, it's going to take a long time to nurture that, and it's through people and change and behaviour. But we have definitely seen businesses where COVID has made them, definitely. They've had to innovate from get-go. Some businesses obviously launched within COVID. We've got the likes of mixologists who were working in the within the hospitality industry, have had to go into ready-made drinks and have built online businesses from that. And like I said, it's still very, very low-key grassroots food economy, but nevertheless it's creating jobs and keeping people active and within the workforce. But equally, I think it caused a lot of innovative soul searching within some of the businesses that maybe have had a longer term trading history. We're very used to doing things a certain way. Say maybe an example would be a restaurant or hospitality chain who had done things in a very certain way for a very, very long time, understood their customer base, but hadn't perhaps ever navel gazed enough to understand that there was other opportunities for them. And I think you saw the examples of curbside pickups and takeaways and high-end takeaways coming out of restaurants. That was all a very, very positive moment for hospitality, I think, because it made them see that there was other sides of the business that they hadn't perhaps explored. And then we also, at the very, very cusp of the pandemic, you'd see some of the particularly sort of spirits and gin distilleries and who were making hand sanitizer in a reaction to the crisis. So yeah, we've very much seen some very positive examples here. But nevertheless, we've still had the challenges that you mentioned earlier, the seafood industry here in the region. I mean, we export 95% of langoustines going to Europe. And, we already had historic challenges with the fishing industry here. And that was just a huge hammer blow to them.
Thanks, Chris. And I suppose one of the themes which underlies the sort of longer term position is what Tom was talking about before, about the sort of climate crisis and the impact of that on all of our lives. Barbara, turning to you, how do we see food and drink businesses responding to this? has the pandemic actually knocked firms off course in terms of the net zero journey, or has it actually accelerated that over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think also connecting to what Chris was saying, I mean, I think it's important to say how during the pandemic, some of these trends, especially around net zero and innovation, have been accelerated. So we've seen, and Chris will be able to tell you more about this, some of their exciting work, but many food and drink SMEs pivoted their operation, trying to adopt more environmental friendly practices. And especially thinking about the sort of logistics and last mile delivery, they try to reduce their carbon footprint. But I think overall, obviously, net zero is a transition and is an important international commitment, which we know comes alongside various challenges. So we've seen various trends within the sector, a shift towards more organic farming, regenerative agriculture, as we often hear, general expansion of land under woodland and energy crops, trying to focus on lower emission farming practices. And all these trends have been coupled on the demand side by dietary changes, behavioral changes, trying to reduce meat consumption of red meat and dairy products towards more healthy and sustainable diet, and trying to reduce as well the food waste and food loss along the chains. Obviously, it's important to stress how there are various challenges and how this process has highlighted some of the intrinsic barriers that characterize food SMEs, but also some of the other SMEs in rural areas as well as urban areas, because I think some of the challenges are common, because there are still barriers in terms of general knowledge, awareness and understanding about the benefits that come together with changing business practices. From the other podcast that you had in December, it was clear how there is obviously like an urgency required, but businesses always tend to think about the short-term sunk costs rather than the sort of like longer-term costs and benefits. So thinking obviously about the high cost investments can be like quite challenging. And also to mention that in just before Christmas in December 2021, NICRE published one of his state-of-the-art review, as we call it, SOTA review. And Neil Ward was talking about some of the challenges associated with the food farming and land use in the context of net zero. And he highlighted how the farming and the land use sectors lag behind other economic sectors in the economy, so in responding to net zero challenges. So obviously the next years to come will be quite critical to transforming the sector. So obviously investment in technologies, low emission pathways will be critical to reach different targets. Some of the latest evidence from DEFRA on farming business practices suggest that still 1 in 3 farmers place very little or no importance on greenhouse gas emissions when making decisions about their farming operations. So I think that is critical to obviously focus on education, knowledge exchange, and the peer-to-peer learning, and also stimulate the sort of reward and support mechanism to facilitate the change. And then I think just to link it a bit with what NICRE is doing in the sort of farming context, but wider within the sort of rural sector, is to try and take businesses alongside the net zero journey, because this is obviously like a long step. So we have this Just One Thing campaign, and the idea is just embark on the journey. You can do one thing, is about making the first step. And obviously there are various challenges, but what we're trying to do is to create this peer-to-peer learning and community where we can share best practices. So this is something that will be live and launched in the next following months. So hopefully it would be like a useful toolkit for rural and farming businesses.
Thanks, Barbara. And I know some of the work that you do involves international comparisons of sort of food supply chains. How do we have particularly long food supply chains in the UK? How do they compare to those internationally? how environmentally friendly are they? And are the lessons that we can learn from policy elsewhere to perhaps sort of implement some of the aspirations in our national food strategy?
Yeah, so some of the work that we were doing was actually looking at the sustainability of different types of food supply chains. And specifically, we focused on alternative type of food networks, trying to understand whether they could be more sustainable and provide more benefits in terms of territorial development. And one of these examples is obviously short food supply chains. And what we mean by this, these are alternative types of production, distribution, and consumption settings, configurations, opposed to the more conventional, longer, and globalized food systems. Examples, obviously, the common ones are farmers markets, box schemes, local farm shops, direct internet sales, which have obviously boomed during the pandemic. And these alternative types of food systems have gained considerable attention in the last decades, also around within the sort of EU policy, because obviously of the numerous benefits that they can bring about to producers in terms of higher value added, local multiplier effects, and increasing their bargaining power. Because I think that the main issue there is that the farming sector, compared to other sectors, is characterized by a very vast majority of very small-scale farmers, predominantly of which are family farms. And also within the sort of agri-food manufacturing businesses, over 90–95% are SMEs. So there are issues in terms of trying to develop more direct retail channels to improve their bargaining power and improve the market opportunities. So there is significant support also that was mobilized within the sort of European Green Deal, Farm to Fork strategy objectives at the EU level, trying to stimulate the development of these type of food channels. So what we were doing as part of Strength to Food, which is these large EU-funded Horizon 2020 project, was try to assess the sustainability of different type of food chains. And I think what emerged is that obviously it all depicts a very complicated pictures, because when we look at sustainability, obviously we need to take into account different elements that come into play. So obviously the economic, the social, the environmental impacts, what are the different indicators that we're looking at, from which actor perspective. And also there are different direct and indirect effects. So I think one of the main findings is that there is obviously heterogeneity across different regions. So there are very different regulatory contexts, social political situations, and food cultural dimensions that may also explain the success of certain initiatives in certain countries, such as Southern Europe, compared to others, such as, for instance, the UK. And mainly the organizational governance and the cooperation level that exists at the horizontal and vertical level seems to be quite intrinsic to the level of success of these initiatives. I mean, these types of food chains have been praised, obviously, for their economic benefits that they can bring. So they can bring along significant price premiums and value added for producers. They can improve their market access. From a social point of view, we always hear about social capital, improving their bargaining power, social cohesion. And there are also like important environmental benefits. If obviously, there is like more consumer awareness towards the way that the food has been produced, the methods of production, higher production standards, animal welfare condition. So there are certain benefits, but also it's important to highlight that there are still numerous challenges that need to be addressed. So we need to be cautious in not generalizing these potential welfare benefits to all types of alternative food networks.
Tom, Barbara's talked a little bit about the sort of innovation in supply chains that has come about perhaps because of the pandemic and the desire for sort of moves towards the net zero transition. Where are farms and agriculture in that position? I mean, Barbara mentioned that only a relatively small proportion of farmers are actually actively thinking about innovation and net zero. Is that your impression, or is that a debate that's going on and about how farms can adjust to reduce the carbon footprint as they go forward?
It's certainly a debate that's going on, and I think we've got to disentangle two things. One is how many farmers are thinking about and doing things about net zero and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the other is how innovative farmers are, because two different things. Just because they're not innovating around a particular agenda doesn't mean that we should assume they're not innovative more generally. And so with net zero, I think it's, we've got to remember that farming nowadays in the UK, as in many other countries, is shaped as much by policy as by markets, and farmers are often hugely competent and precise in responding to the incredibly complicated systems of payments that are available and so on. And so, when we're looking at the fact that at a kind of headline level, agriculture has been lagging on GHGs, on greenhouse gases, gas reductions relative to, say, other parts of the economy, including the food sector, that is largely a policy failure. It's not a lack of innovation within the sector. And that's because the current policies have been locking people into ways of farming that have made it kind of not really worthwhile responding to the net zero challenge so much. So we need to see that as distinct from the question of how innovative farmers are. And I think we have this mental image of farmers as culturally conservative, and also actually sometimes the data seems to show maybe that farming SMEs might not be as innovative as other parts of the economy. I think that says more about our mental images of farmers and of how we measure innovation than it does about how innovative many farmers are. I think for a sector of micro enterprises, there's a huge amount of innovation going on and has been kind of forever. When we think of our concepts of innovation and how far they're founded in the agricultural revolution and so on, there's really long tradition of both on-farm and off-farm, the adoption of off-farm innovations by farmers. So you've got a huge post-war surge in productivity, some of that driven by farmers changing their practices and coming up with new solutions on farms, some of it driven by the development of new products that farmers adopted. But it's like a massive shift in practice and in the outputs of farming and its efficiency. And now we have, for example, I was involved in setting up something called Innovative Farmers, which is about supporting innovation directly by farmers on farms on their own terms much more effectively than has generally been the case, but recognizing that a lot of farmers experiment with new things, try out new approaches, kind of hack the products that they buy, the services and products they buy. They're used to hacking them, to changing how they work, to adapting them to their situation and behaving genuinely kind of in a pretty intrinsically innovative way. And I think a lot of that is below the radar in terms of how we measure innovation. So the US Department of Agriculture compiles some of the kind of big global stats on where the innovation is happening within agriculture. They don't even have a category for innovation by farmers. You've got veterinary innovation, you've got innovation in plant protection products, you've got innovation in machinery, you've got innovation in various different bits of the supply chain that feeds farming. But the idea that farming itself is innovative, there's not even a category for that, which is just mind-boggling given the huge kind of how endemic innovative behavior is among a lot of farmers. And then when you think of total factor productivity, so one of the other ways you might capture innovation in farming, a lot of the innovation that we want at the moment, which is about aligning the delivery of public goods with the ways that you're also serving a market, actually that doesn't necessarily show up in total factor productivity growth. So I think there are real limitations in the sort of fairly clumsy ways we track innovation when it comes to identifying and supporting the innovation that farmers do.
I think there's a real issue there, Tom, with measurement of innovation, both in farms and many other companies mean, we have a UK innovation survey which completely ignores micro businesses, for example, which seems always rather a mistake to me. I mean, those are the largest group of businesses in the country, and yet we understand almost nothing about their innovative behaviours. So it's that there are definitely gaps in our sort of statistical basis for understanding innovation. Chris, I wanted to come to you. We've talked a little bit about sort of innovation in the supply chain, and I wanted to go to the other end of the spectrum a little bit, and say whether you think that consumer tastes are actually driving a little bit of sort of innovation and change. I mean, are you seeing a situation where consumers are wanting greener products, more products which are lower carbon, and is that influencing the companies that you're working with?
100%, Stephen. I think what we've seen, I think we ran a project at the beginning of the pandemic called Local Heroes, and it was a virtual marketplace which basically aggregated all of the perishable goods that we could see traders were not going to move on, and we set up a zero emissions delivery service, and we ran that as a 1-year project, so we could measure why people were buying from us and what were the drivers. And you could see, I mean, after the first lockdown, we came out of the first lockdown, you could see the benchmark had slightly risen in terms of how people were adopting local supply chain. And then when you saw that drop again, and then it risen again. So the benchmark's certainly up there now. And people, what we are seeing from consumers is a real drive for local adoption in terms of supply chain. And I think that would have been prominent 2 or 3 years ago here in the Northeast anyway, but very much across a certain demographic. So, you know, middle class communities would have already been higher on their agenda. But what we've seen that broaden, and we're involved in a little bit of strategic work with local authorities, looking at the importance of food markets to the local economy, but also in how those markets incubate new business and new food entrepreneurs. And you can see, you know, a seismic increase in footfall and people visiting food markets and buying from local traders. We've got traders who we've worked with and we've measured their sales growth, and they've seen 70 to 80% increase on sales. And it's made food markets a much more lucrative approach to their consumer base now. And to answer your question around innovation, it's absolutely informed how people are launching new business. So we've seen the rise of new urban mushroom farms, vertical farmers who are growing microherbs to go into hospitality. It's really it's moved us. I mean, Tom, you'll understand this. It's moved us past the point of tokenism within the sustainability agenda in food and drink, and to a point where we're seeing some real meaningful adaptation within business.
Thanks, Chris. All this talk of food's making me a bit hungry around the edges, but I guess there are many challenges and opportunities ahead for all of the actors, both sort of agricultural and food producers in the economy in years to come. We'll finish just with a quick thought from each of you, if we may, around what the kind of key policy priority might be over the next few years. Tom, let's come to you first.
Oh, blimey! Choose one, eh? So we got 14 recommendations in the National Food Strategy, and that was cutting it down quite a lot in terms of the huge range of things in there. I think around the issues we've been talking about now, I think one of the challenges in policy terms is to get the environmental payments, which are going towards farming now, so all these new payments, much more on an innovation footing. So there's separate money for innovation in food productivity, particularly, than those environmental payments. And so you've got this risk where you end up almost sort of, as a taxpayer, renting the environmental benefits forever from relatively static businesses. Meanwhile, they're being encouraged to innovate and invest in other directions for their business. What you actually want is for those things to be aligned. We want to be investing as taxpayers in a transition, a kind of smooth as possible restructure of farming, so that you've got that alignment of delivering the sort of environmental benefits we need from farming, and we really do need them, but also at the same time, feeding those short supply chains that Barbara and Chris were talking about, developing those new markets and so on as well. So it's all about that alignment. At the minute, the policy sort of, if anything, make that difficult, even the new ones that are coming in and being designed. So trying to get them to work in a joined up way like that would be top of my list.
Chris, what's top of your policy hit list for the next year or two?
Well, mine hasn't changed for the last 2 years, Stephen. I think, this is a very northeast problem, and obviously it's what I'm here to advocate. Food and drink is not on the local industrial strategy here in the region, and I think if the work that's happened with the National Food Strategy Review is going to be adopted and is going to be the most critical intervention that has ever happened in the food and drink sector, then we need to see that on the industrial strategy. And the challenge that we've had as an organisation is that we're coming from a very low base. It's not a particularly buoyant sector, food, drink, agriculture here in the northeast. And I think part of that is an opportunity, because we're approaching all of these challenges with quite a blank canvas, and it gives us some license to innovate from the get-go. But if we cannot get local authorities and local governance to take this sector seriously, then it's very difficult to get our community mobilised in a way that we can make a difference.
And Barbara, let's come to you finally, just for a quick thought on policy direction or policy futures.
Obviously from my main area of expertise and interest, the keyword would be like cooperation. So really, if we're thinking about local community networks, knowledge hubs to sort of foster more cooperation and knowledge and innovation. So we've seen that the success of local food chains and quality food markets is intrinsic to consumer trust and more awareness on good production methods and good environmental stewardship. And also we've seen how digital innovation can play like a crucial role in this area to really foster the net zero agenda in the context of the food and drink sector, to promote more coordinated logistics and also like increase consumer awareness. So I think this is where as well the cooperation between NICRE and FANE is making some big steps, I think, and I would like to hope in his important area of work.
Thanks very much, everyone. It's been a fascinating conversation. I think we could have gone on very much longer, but we're over time now. So thanks very much, Tom, Chris and Barbara, for a very thought-provoking time today. And I'm sure that some of the themes that we've raised today around innovation, changing food cultures, we'll come back to in future ERC podcasts. Thanks to all of you who are listening to this podcast too. If you enjoyed it and you want to find out more about the ERC's work, you can visit our website at www.enterpriseresearch.ac.uk. And if you type the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise into your favourite search engine, you'll find lots more there about the work of NICRE. Thanks very much for your company today, and join us again for the next edition of Exploring Enterprise in the near future. Thank you.